So I appreciate you being here. I'll turn it over here to Phil, who is our new stormwater superintendent, one of the a new division we created in the Hampden Township Public Works as a result of the stormwater management bid.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming today. As Jeremy said, my role with the township is stormwater superintendent. Jeremy and the township commissioners and the authority members got the program started, and they were in the genesis of the stormwater program here in Hampden Township. I'm kind of on the implementation end of things. My role is both infrastructure and MS4, and so I just about anything related to stormwater at some point in the game crosses my desk. For those of you who are here for this for the stormwater fee, the fertilizer fee credit, please make sure you sign in. And actually, if you all could sign in, just so we have your names. One of the things that we like to do is document the attendance at these things for our MS4 program. But my knowledge, you didn't come here to listen to my knowledge of fertilizers and whatnot, so I am going to turn it over to the expert here. We have today Dr. Peter Landscoot with Pennsylvania State University. This gentleman probably knows more about fertilizers in 1 week than I do in my whole career. So I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Landscoot, and
they're not that difficult, actually.
Quick question. You said MS4. What's MS4?
MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. It's federal.
It'd probably be best if you want everybody to sign it. If you just pass it around,
okay, we can do that.
Easier than standing up in front.
While you're doing that, I'll just get started. So I don't want to keep you here any longer than you have to be here. First of all, thanks to Bill and Jeremy for inviting me down here to speak today on the topic of lawn fertilization. This is kind of a new thing for me. My job usually, I have to go out and give presentations to professional turfgrass managers like golf course superintendents, athletic field managers, and lawn care professionals. And I'm guessing that's not your livelihood, right? Okay. So I'm going to take a somewhat technical subject matter topic and try to make this as non-technical as possible, just so you can kind of get the feel for the do's and don'ts of lawn fertilization, basically. The title of the presentation is Lawn Fertilization, Essential or Expendable. I mean, there is actually people who have suggested, because of water quality issues, that we no longer use turfgrass fertilizers. There's no laws against it now. Anybody can pretty much do what they want. But our goal is to just try to get people to use it in a responsible manner. There's also a group of people that, you know, maybe just don't like turf in general and lawns in general. And I just wanted to start this off by saying that lawns are a really important part of the urban landscape. That's why I study it. They're very good at conserving soil. They have very fibrous root systems, so they hold soil together. And they're effective to some extent in slowing runoff, especially from impervious surfaces. So they really have a strong function in the urban landscape. Plus, for recreation purposes, they make sense as a ground cover for suburban housing areas. Okay, watch. So I just want to preview the talk this morning, and I plan to go for about 40 minutes and then leave about 15 minutes for you if you have any questions. If there's no questions, then you can take off early. Okay, so the problem really that we're dealing with now is nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers and from other sources are increasingly part of the water quality issue in the United States. When I first got into this business back in the 1970s, I started working on a golf course. The main concern environmentally were pesticides. Everybody was really concerned about pesticides. Nobody ever talked about fertilization and water quality. Over the decades now, there's less concern about pesticides because they're getting safer. We used to have some horrible pesticides and they're no longer available. Now they're more specific to the pests and not as dangerous. But nitrogen and phosphorus are starting to become part of the picture now because of contamination of water quality. EPA and Pennsylvania are now engaged in an effort to set what they call a pollution diet for Pennsylvania and restrict some of the fertilization that goes on, and as well as some other sources of nitrogen and phosphorus as well. Question I want to pose to you today is lawn fertilization contributing to the problem, and I'll go over some of my thoughts, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit. There are people who wonder, you know, are fertilizers really needed in the urban landscape for grasses? And if you are using them, what can you do to help reduce any potential contamination that may result? So that's what I wanted to cover today. Okay, I'll start out by talking about the problem a little bit. Okay, this is a map of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. I don't have a pointer, but we're somewhere in the middle there, just above the Maryland border. I think no matter what side of this issue you're on with some of the restrictions regarding fertilizer, I think one thing everybody can agree on is we all want clean water. And I've done a lot of traveling in my career. I've done a lot of overseas work, and one thing I can tell you, I've been to places where they don't have clean water, and it's something I no longer take for granted. You wouldn't want to live there, believe me. Fortunately, we have relatively clean water here, and we should be thankful for that. As precipitation falls, though, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, it ends up going into gullies and creeks, a lot of it, and along the way down the Susquehanna River, down to the Chesapeake Bay, it does pick up nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment, and those are the big concerns, because nitrogen and phosphorus will stimulate plant growth, not just your grass, but growth of plants in water, like algae. The question that a lot of regulators, environmentalists, concerned citizens have is, where is the nitrogen and phosphorus coming from? Well, it's coming from many different sources. Pennsylvania, as you know because you live here, is a lot of rolling hills, mountains. Topography is not flat, so there's runoff issues. Our soils are highly erodible. So in agricultural operations, one of the big concerns is how do you keep that soil in place and keep the fertilizer, manure, and soil from running off into water sources. So we know there's nitrogen and phosphorus coming from those areas. Wastewater treatment, something everybody contributes to. Wastewater treatment plants do a good job of taking some of the really bad things out, but not all the nitrogen and phosphorus. So a lot of it's coming in from those sources as well. Even forests. As I was driving down here today, driving along the Narrows around Lewistown, which is heavily forested areas. But you look at the Juniata River, it looks like chocolate milk because of all the rain we had up there. A lot of sediment coming off of those hills as well. And developed areas, what we're going to be talking about today. That's another source as well. The EPA has taken a stab at trying to quantify where the nitrogen and phosphorus is coming from. They developed things called watershed models. This is based on a lot of research they've done and sampling from different streams and rivers. And they estimate about 52% of the nitrogen and 50% of the phosphorus come from agricultural operations. And a lot of these are animal operations, dairy farms, mostly in Pennsylvania. So that's our main source of nitrogen and phosphorus. But when you look at nitrogen, developed areas contribute a fair amount too, about 20%. That's an estimate, but and we don't know what part of the development is doing that, but it's just from developed areas, 20%. And from forests, about 17. Some of that is air pollution that is deposited in forests as nitrogen compounds that ends up in the water. And 11% is wastewater. For phosphorus, a lot of the phosphorus comes in, other than agriculture, comes in from wastewater treatment plants. Forests, and about 12% from developed areas. Okay. So getting back to the developed areas, this is what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to ask you a question, and take a look at that slide. This is a new housing development in Maryland, an aerial shot. Where do you think the problems are when it comes to issues of stormwater control when you look at that slide?
got a lot of road surface.
A lot of road surface, that's right. What else?
It's going into the drains along the road surfaces.
It's going into drains, but where is the water coming from before it gets to the drain? What are some of the sources of runoff that you can see there, other than roads?
Roofs.
Rooftops, okay. Parking lots, sidewalks, there's a tennis court there, okay. Where are the pervious surfaces?
Everywhere else.
Right. Lawns, I mean, it's not ideal, you know, there's runoff from lawns too, if the storms are heavy enough, but that is a green space that will absorb some. Whatever doesn't get absorbed goes down into that gully. Maybe some of it will be absorbed there, but eventually that's going into that blue water downstream. So our main concerns are what's coming off of these pavements, okay? But we're also concerned somewhat of what's coming off the lawns too, and that's where fertilizer comes in. Okay, wherever the sources are, they're eventually the nitrogen and phosphorus, if it gets down into the river, the Susquehanna River, it's probably going to get into the Chesapeake Bay. One of the problems with the bay is, from my sources and listening to seminars given by experts, is it's a fairly shallow body of water. It's a huge estuary, but the average depth is only about 21 feet. So if you get a lot of sediment in that body of water, it's going to create more problems. And nitrogen and phosphorus stimulates plant growth, including algae. And a lot of times, if you fly over the Chesapeake Bay in the summer, you'll see these huge algal blooms occurring. And a lot of that is because there's excess nutrients and sediment in that water, and it's very shallow. Okay. So what's the problem with algae? It depletes oxygen, which is needed by wildlife, okay? Habitat and water. When algae die, they sink to the bottom, they undergo decomposition, and that consumes oxygen, okay? Also, algae shade out light, and it prevents desirable species of plants and water from getting sunlight, and it, again, degrades habitat. So anything which is going to produce these large algal blooms is going to result in degradation of water quality. All right, so why should we care about the Chesapeake Bay? Well, it's not in our state, right? It is the largest estuary in the United States, and it is a national treasure. It's over 3,000 different species of plants, fish, and other animals. It contributes a lot of money to the economies down there, but that's not the real reason why I'm concerned, because if you compare that with the agricultural industry, $750 million is not that much. You know, the ag industry is a lot bigger than that. So it's not about the money. It's a huge watershed, 64,000 square miles, encompassing parts of 6 states in the District of Columbia. And the big thing, where my interest is those 17 million people who live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. A lot of that is down in Maryland, southeastern Pennsylvania. As you get further north, there's fewer people. But our concern is right around this area. And when you have a lot of people, you have a lot of farms to support those people, right? A lot of those are animal farms, poultry farms, which create a lot of phosphorus. Animal farms like dairy farms, again, a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus put on the land, okay? As well as fertilizer to produce crops. And because of this degradation of water quality in the Chesapeake Bay, there are regulations in place. Now, I will say, I've been following this issue for a number of years, and it's getting better. That's the good news. If you look at what the problems were back in the 1980s, we've come a long way with reduction of nitrogen and phosphorus. But to get to where EPA wants to get, you know, you've got to go further, and there's a question of whether we'll ever really get there, but they're trying. So they developed this program recently called the Chesapeake Bay TMDL program, which stands for Total Maximum Daily Load, and that's the amount of pollutant, in this case nitrogen and phosphorus, a water body can handle and still be considered healthy. Okay, what does healthy mean? That's got to be defined by a group of people. Okay, so we can have arguments on that, but we're not there yet according to the EPA. So EPA calls this a pollution diet. And what they've done is they've worked with the states to develop caps on sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And each state has a certain amount of pollutant that they can put in, not intentionally, but can go into the Susquehanna River and down into Chesapeake Bay. And by 2025, we're supposed to meet these standards. Whether now the political climate is different, so we'll see what happens. But that's the plan right now, and that's what we're living under. Okay. So let's switch back to lawns now. That's a little bit of the problem that we're dealing with. Okay. So where do lawns come in? Well, there's a contribution. There's no question about that. It's not as big as agriculture, and it's not as big as wastewater treatment in a lot of cases. So what is the problem here? It's interesting, if you talk to Scott's company, the representative from Scott's company, who sells the most lawn fertilizers of anybody in the United States, they'll say that most people don't even fertilize their lawn. And most of their clients who buy their products only fertilize about once per year. So I was always amazed to hear that. But most people are not really putting much fertilizer down in their lawns. What we're trying to do is prevent over-application from a very small segment of the population. Well, I've taken a lot of courses in plants, plant biology, plant physiology, soils, and they always start off by making you memorize, every one of these courses makes you memorize the 16 essential plant nutrients. All right, and it just drove me nuts when I was going through school. Because most of these are freebies. We don't have to really worry about the micronutrients in our soils around here. They're loaded with micronutrients. Okay? We don't ever apply them on lawns or large properties. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which makes up over 90% of the plant, where's that come from? Water and carbon dioxide. It's fixed by photosynthesis, right? And calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, sometimes they're deficient, but usually that's supplied by lime, calcium, magnesium. If your pH is low in your garden or in your soil, you put a little lime on and that takes care of it for the next 10, 15 years. Okay? Most of the time you don't even need it. What you might need to have a good quality lawn is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Okay? And if you go into a lawn and garden center and you look at the back of a fertilizer bag, you'll see 3 numbers there. Anybody know what those mean? And PK, right, nitrogen, phosphate, indication of how much phosphorus is in there, and potash or potassium, okay? Now that's an old label, this big old lawn fertilizer. Most of the products, I would say probably about 98% of the products that are used for turf maintenance fertilization now, that middle number is 0. Because most products that are being produced by companies that sell to lawn care operators and home lawn enthusiasts who want to do their own fertilization are phosphate-free now. So that's a good thing because that's something we don't have to worry about so much anymore in turf. Okay? Next slide. But we still apply nitrogen primarily. And the question always comes up when I talk to homeowners, lawn care, landscapers, how much do you apply? Okay? And it's not an easy question to answer because it depends on a lot of things. It depends on how old the lawn is. It depends on how good the soil is that you're trying to grow grass in, or any kind of plant for that matter, right? It depends on the species you're growing. Kentucky bluegrass, in this picture, usually requires more nitrogen than another species that we grow around here called tall fescue. Okay? And the major factor is, what does the owner of the property want the grass to look like or respond like? Okay? And maybe he's a sports turf manager, he or she. Okay? You want a pretty dense turf under a lot of wear, you're going to have to put more fertilizer down typically. This is a photograph of a house which is down in Gettysburg. It's somebody I know. And this individual puts down one application of fertilizer per year. It's an old lawn, it's probably 30, 40 years old. It recycles organic matter, some of that converted to nitrogen. It's a good topsoil. He's pretty happy with what he has here. There's not a whole lot of weeds in there, pretty good turf growth. One application per year, it's pretty happy. And if it's applied at the right time of the year, not too much of a problem. We've got a lot of research to show that these kind of applications are not considered to be detrimental from a standpoint of runoff or leaching. This is a different scenario. This is more typical of a new housing development. This is in State College. This lawn is about a year and a half old. It was a housing development that was built on a very poor soil, seeded with perennial ryegrass, which is a high nitrogen requiring grass, but the reason why landscapers like it is because it germinates fast and grows fast. And they get paid, and they can get out and get on to the next job. Okay, and it looks nice and green, right? Because they're pumping a lot of nitrogen on that, so it'll fill in. And once it fills in, they can back off if the lawn care company will do that. Okay? Now, usually the lawn has to be 3 or 4 years old, and then you can start backing off a little bit on the nitrogen. So now, I'm not saying that this is a big environmental hazard, because we want to get ground cover on that soil, so you don't get a lot of runoff and you don't get soil. Okay? And sometimes there's a trade-off, and you have to put a little bit more fertilizer on to get to that point, and then you can start backing off again. And here's the other extreme. This is a house, front lawn of a house up the street from me that hasn't had fertilizer put down in probably 20 or 30 years. Now, I've seen other lawns where you do have a fair amount of grass if they haven't fertilized in 20 or 30 years. But it kind of depends on the situation. This is a poor soil. It's really compact. There's traffic on here. And it's just generally neglected, okay? And this is what I would consider something, one house or two houses like this is not a big deal. But if the entire neighborhood was like this, and you had it on a hillside, which this is, then you're going to get more runoff from these areas, okay? So in some cases, a little bit of fertilizer probably will help the situation in preventing runoff from some of these lawns. Okay, so one thing I wanted to just focus on here is a little bit on phosphorus and a little bit of nitrogen, and then I'll talk about some things that we can do to try to prevent runoff of fertilizers. Okay, so the question sometimes comes up, why don't we just ban phosphorus completely from all plant systems, crops, turf, vegetable gardens? And there's a general thought out there that there's just plenty of phosphorus in the soil. In a lot of cases there is, and it doesn't really move in soils very readily. Okay, but this is a greenhouse experiment that a graduate student of mine performed just to look at what levels of phosphorus are needed for good turf growth. And you can get low enough so that you can run into a deficiency, as you can see here. And a deficiency of phosphorus on grass usually looks like a reddish or purple color, and the grass gets really spindly and thin. And it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you put on that, if it's limiting in phosphorus, it's not going to respond. Okay. And here's a photograph in the field. Now this is a housing development that was just built in State College a couple of years ago. And this is the entrance. You see it comes off of the main road in the background. And the company that did this excavated the area, didn't do a really great job, took away some of the topsoil and left a lot of subsoil there that they tried to grade. And then they threw some cheap grass seed mix on there, got paid, and left, and never followed up on it. And what you're looking at is about 6 months later, that turf is starting to thin out. And you see, I don't know, you can see a reddish color there. The colors aren't quite right on this projector, but that's a reddish color and kind of a yellowish color. That's a nitrogen and phosphorus deficiency. And that's just going to get worse and worse, and the plants are going to start dying off, and now you have a situation where you're not going to get a whole lot of infiltration, you're going to get more runoff from that area. So again, here's a situation where a little bit of fertilizer probably would have helped this situation. So how do you determine really how much phosphorus you need in a situation like this? The only way to do this is really take a soil test. And this is something we're really trying to encourage more and more. If you're interested in really doing a good job with fertilization, no matter what crop you're managing, take a soil test every couple of years, and that will tell you how much phosphorus you have in your soil. And we usually give recommendations on how much to apply to meet the needs and not become excessive. Okay. So I don't want to get too technical here, but I just want to tell you that we've done a lot of research at Penn State. Another land-grant university has done a lot of research to find what level is appropriate. That you don't run into a deficiency, but you don't put so much on that you're running into a situation where you're going to get runoff of soluble phosphorus. Okay? And we found that level is about 45 parts per million up to about 200 parts per million. And when we look at the samples that we get in from lawns all over the state, we do several thousand per year. This is a 5-year summary, 34,000 plus soil samples that have come in. We found that about 40% of the individuals who bothered to take a soil test, so presumably they're interested in the quality of their lawns, okay? 40% are below that 45 parts per million. Now that doesn't mean the grass is deficient, but the lower you get, the more likely you are to run into a deficiency. And about 53% is where we want them to be, sort of in the middle. And then 7% is excessive. And that, over 200 parts per million, we think that there's an issue with runoff. So efforts now are kind of focused on that 7% and trying to find out why they're putting so much phosphorus on and to try to get people not to do that anymore. We do need phosphorus for certain things, and one of them is seeding new lawns. And there is phosphorus legislation on turfgrass fertilizers all over the United States. Pennsylvania doesn't have a law yet, but I think there will be very shortly. I know there's a draft of some legislation floating around now. And one of the exemptions they give for phosphorus is if you're establishing a new lawn, because seedlings of plants usually need some phosphorus for good root development. And again, we're trying to get cover on that ground as fast as possible so we don't get erosion. Okay, so here's a group of landscapers seeding grass at our arboretum about 10 years ago in the middle of November, which is way too late to be seeding. And that happens a lot, unfortunately, here in Pennsylvania. And you run the risk of getting a lot of erosion over the winter if you don't get ground cover. Well, phosphorus is really important, especially when you have cold temperatures, for root uptake and development of plants. So about the only thing you can find on the market now for turf grasses that contains phosphorus is something called a starter fertilizer. And how many of you have ever heard of that, starter fertilizer? Okay, is that something that you understand what they mean by that? Because there's a lot of people who don't. Okay, a starter, okay, so think of the word starter, okay? So starter fertilizer means this is something you put down when you're trying to establish a new lawn or doing some renovation work and you're trying to get plants to grow. That's what they mean by starter, okay? And then once the plants germinate and get growing, then you can switch over to a maintenance fertilizer, which is different and won't contain any phosphorus. So you can still go into Home Depot, Lowe's, Tractor Supply, and buy phosphorus, but it's only supposed to be used for establishing new lawns or doing some renovation overseeding work, okay? And you can see that it contains a fair amount of phosphorus, 10, 10, 10. So that middle number is the phosphorus, okay? 16, 18, 18, or 6, 18, 18, 18, 24, 10 is a real common one. Okay. But again, they're only supposed to be used for establishing new lawns. And here's why. Okay, so this is an experiment we did a long time ago, back in 1992, when I first got to Penn State. looking at the effect of startup fertilizer on turf establishment. And a lot of this is from nitrogen, but it's also partially from phosphorus too. Again, we're trying to get turf cover on bare soil, and that's why we make that exception for phosphorus-containing fertilizers. It's a pretty dramatic difference if you try to get turf going without startup fertilizer versus with. Okay, let's switch to nitrogen. Nitrogen needed for lawns in some cases. This is a lawn, again, in my neighborhood. Probably hasn't been fertilized in 20 years, and it's mostly moss, not so much grass. This is what happens over a long period of time if you don't use any nitrogen at all. Okay? Unfortunately, we can't soil test for nitrogen. We can test the soil for nitrogen, but it doesn't mean anything because nitrogen moves in the system so rapidly. It's incorporated by microorganisms. It's volatilized out of the soil into the atmosphere. It leaches as it runs off. It just is very, very mobile in the turf grass system. So we don't soil test for nitrogen. We do it for phosphorus, but not for nitrogen. So instead, what we do is we try to look at the condition of the turf and then determine your nitrogen needs based on the quality of the grass. Okay? So here's a situation where this lawn probably needs a little nitrogen. It's pretty yellow. That indicates a deficiency. It's getting thin. There's a lot of weeds moving in. And sometimes we get this disease called red thread, which will be coming out in about a month. These little pink patches that occur in your lawn. Very, very common in early June. Sometimes an indication of a nitrogen deficiency. So again, you know, it kind of depends on the preference of the homeowner as to what they want their lawn to look like. But to me, this would indicate you probably could use one application of nitrogen anyway. Okay. We also provide ranges of nitrogen, and 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet is usually what you find on a bag of fertilizer. They'll tell you 1 application per 5,000 square feet. Usually it's about 1 pound per 1,000 square feet. Just about all fertilizers are in that range. 0.9, 0.75, 1, sometimes somewhere in there. So when we give recommendations at Penn State, we give quite a wide range because we know older lawns require less. A certain species like tall fescue, which we're really trying to encourage people to use, especially down in this area because it requires less nitrogen, and it's a really good species, we can get by with a little bit less. But a lot of this depends on the type of soil you have, the grass you're growing, the age of the lawn, what you're expecting out of the application as to how much you use. So if you're going at the high end of the rate, you want to put it down maybe 4 times a year. If you're at the low end of the rate, like I am, I only put about 1 pound down on my lawn every year, and it looks fine. So there's quite a range here that we suggest. Okay. But pretty important too at what time of year you put it down. You want maximum uptake by the plant. You don't want it leaching, you don't want it volatilizing, and you don't want it running off. So when you put it down when the plant is going to utilize it, which would be this time of year. Okay? I'm probably going to treat my lawn in a week or 2. All right? And I'm going to be very aware of what's going to be happening during that week, weather-wise. Now Monday, I guess you guys didn't have as much of a storm as we did in State College. We had torrential rains over a very short period of time. My backyard looked like a river. Fortunately, all flowed into my neighbor's yard, and that's where it all stayed. Just kept going. But if I had put down fertilizer a day or 2 before that, that would have carried that fertilizer downstream. Okay? And what we try to do is, yes, put it down in the spring, but you either water it in or wait for a forecast where you get a light rain to water it in. Don't put it down before a heavy rain. So May, and then the other time of year, if you're going to make 2 applications, would be sometime around late August, early September. And if I was going to put down 1 application per year for the health of the grass, I don't do it myself, but I always tell people this is the best time of year to put it down is late September, or I'm sorry, late August, early September, right around Labor Day. Because that's when the plants are producing carbohydrates, which they use as food throughout the rest of the year. In the spring, they're using up their food reserves really fast because the grass is growing really fast. But, you know, that's also a decent time to fertilize too. And if you're using a weed-in feed for crabgrass control, it has to be put down a little bit earlier to prevent crabgrass from emerging, because crabgrass seed germinates sometime in early May, so you got to get the product down a little before that. Okay, so around here you want to get it down around mid-April, and up in State College we say late April. Okay, so that would be the exception of putting it down, fertilizer down in May. A lot of times the crabgrass preventers are put on top of fertilizer, so you buy both of them in the same bag. All right, so the final part of the presentation, and I'll just kind of go through this very quickly, is what can you do to attempt to reduce nutrient loading in lawns, okay? All right, so I talked earlier, if you're going to get nitrogen and phosphorus losses around here, it's probably going to be runoff with surface water. Our soils are really heavy, we have a lot of clay, we have a lot of silt in our soils. Leaching is not the main avenue that we lose nutrients. It's usually runoff from the surface. Okay, so that's what we're primarily concerned with. All right, so where does that occur? When you have steep slopes, you gotta be really careful. Soil compaction, because the fertilizer isn't going to go into the soil as readily, right? Frozen ground, that's a big no-no. Okay, applications just higher before a heavy rain. I talked about that just a couple minutes ago. Extremely high rates of nitrogen and phosphorus. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes people think, hey, if they're recommending X amount of fertilizer per application, my lawn is going to look twice as good if I put twice as much down, right? It doesn't happen often, but it does happen, all right? And then more cover and density, which I talked about too. If you don't have very good turf cover on there, you're going to get more runoff. Right? So where it really counts, and I think this is the most important avenue of loss, is new establishment. So this is Jacobsburg State Park. I was on a hike up there a couple of years ago. I was visiting friends in Allentown, right near Allentown. And we came out of the woods, and I saw this. And this was a new building that they put up. And they had this establishment program going where they filled up the soil, graded it, hydroseeded it with fertilizer and mulch and seed in the hydroseeder, okay? Now what you don't see here is any barriers to prevent runoff, like a silt fence or a filter sock, which you see around new construction sites these days, okay? There's nothing here, right? All right, and then they got this torrential downpour not too long after they established it, and guess what happened? All of that went right into the parking lot and right down that drain, and I went over and just was curious to see where that drain went right into Jacobsburg Creek. Okay, so it's taking all the fertilizer, seed, and the soil, contaminating that water. Okay. And that was the first exhibit by Jacobsburg Environmental Education Center. It was a state job. Ignore the regulations, you know, and there you have it. Okay, so this is what you should be doing, and this would be a construction company. You wouldn't do this yourself, but any new construction site, you'll see silt fence around it, filter socks. You should be seeing some kind of barrier to prevent soil movement into water resources. Okay, here's another photograph of erosion control mats. Again, this is a turf establishment. They put these mats over it. It allows some light and moisture to penetrate, but it keeps the soil stable until the grass is up and growing. Okay. And here's that picture again of the guys seeding when it's November. Actually, seeding should take place right around Labor Day, late August, Labor Day, early September. And we always say if you go into October with most grasses, you better start increasing your seed rate, because a lot of that seed is going to die. It's just not going to make it through the winter. And by the time you get to middle October, all bets are off. And yet you see people out sometimes seeding in November, and that's a recipe for a lot of erosion and wasted time and wasted money. Okay, getting turf cover, as I talked about that before. Okay, here's another one that I'm concerned about too. We all are concerned about this. And so here you see a professional applicator making a pass with a rotary spreader right along a roadway. Okay, so what's happening here? So a lot of fertilizer goes out into the road. Okay, and then you have these granulars on an impervious surface. Okay, and when it rains, all that's going to go down into the storm drainage. So there's a couple things you can do to prevent this. And one is, instead of starting here, he can make his first pass on the grass in a little bit further, so that not as much of that fertilizer is going out into the street. A lot of times you'll see applicators start near the house and then work their way out. And you might end up right on the edge. Okay? So better to start a little bit inward and then work your way towards the house. Okay? Now, for professional applicators, they're making these things called deflectors. You see that white piece of tubing on the side? And a professional applicator can push a lever, and that deflector will come down, and it will force those granulars in, back on the grass. And so it's not as much will go into the street. So we're seeing more and more of that in the professional end of things. So unfortunately, you can't get these as homeowners. I see more and more, not everybody, but I see more and more companies now blowing off as much of those granules as they can. You can't get them all. I've tried it. You can't get them all, but you can make a big difference by just going after the fact and blowing those granules back onto the turf. Here's a challenge. This is not too far away from here, housing development. And I was out one day with some guys from Baumberger Tomlinson, a local big lawn care company. And they said, well, we just got the contract for this development, and we're a little concerned because we're going to try to blow the granules back on to the turf, and look what they're dealing with here. They can't do it because that curbing is about that high, right? So they decided they were going to go with liquid applications and try to do it that way. But I also see more and more curbing going in like this, and this is kind of nice because you can get probably about 98% of those granules back onto the grass if you have more of that flat curbing. Water in the applications after you put them down. Now, not everybody has that flexibility, especially if you have large properties. But when I fertilize my lawn, I have a fairly small lawn. I just put the sprinkler out, let it go for 3 or 4 times, just to get it in so if a heavy rain comes, it's not going to wash off. And then, we spend a lot of time with the professional applicators getting them to calibrate spreaders properly. If they can get within 5% accuracy, they're doing pretty good. Because these devices, unfortunately, are not the most accurate thing. Liquid applications are better, but people freak when they see liquid applications. They think you're putting something really toxic down. And that's why a lot of lawn care companies switched over to spreaders. People are more accepting of that. It's kind of funny, but it's true. So we spend a lot of time getting them to calibrate so they're putting the right rate down. Returning clippings. It used to be popular back in the 70s and 80s when I was first entering the business to collect your clippings, put them out on the street, and then companies would come and collect them. Well, you're throwing away fertilizer basically when you're doing that. And we've done a lot of studies where we estimate that you can get as much of a third of your fertilizer put right back into the ground when the clippings break down. They're releasing the nitrogen and phosphorus going right back down into the soil. Okay. So this is taboo now. Okay, and then soil testing. And it's not just for phosphorus, it's for pH too. And this applies to gardens, any kind of plant system you have. If you have a really strongly acid soil, very, very extremely acid, a lot of times the plants can't utilize the nutrients effectively. So we always try to say, get your pH in balance. You know, we try to get the soils to a near neutral area, and that allows the soil chemistry to work so that you get better uptake of nutrients. It's a little complex from a chemical standpoint, but it works. So I think liming is a really important thing. It's part of your fertilizer program too. We're not so concerned about lime moving off-site and contaminating water. That's not really an issue. It's very, very immobile. You put it in the soil, it takes about 3 or 4 years for that to work down through the root system if you put a surface application of lime. So we want you to test every few years to make sure that you have a good pH in your soil. And I'm just closing with this. There are some advances in technology that are coming down the line. These are used in the professional end of the business right now. I think they're going to make it to the homeowner market before too long. Polyurethane coatings. There's several products out in the market now that release nitrogen very slowly, and it's really gauged with temperature and moisture, so that at the times of the year when you're getting optimum temperatures and moisture for plant growth, it's releasing more of the nitrogen. When things are really dry, when you don't want the nitrogen to release, it's not releasing. Okay? Also, it's somewhat temperature controlled. So if you put this fertilizer down in fall, and there's a little bit left before winter, it's not supposed to release nitrogen below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a good thing too for fall fertilization. Also, there are things called urease inhibitors and nitrification inhibitors. I'm not going to get into that with you, but that's supposedly, these products are supposed to keep nitrogen in a form that's not as readily leached. Okay, so there is some new technology coming down the line, which is better. Okay. So just to close, just wanted to summarize. I think the main thing is keep the fertilizer on the turf, get it off the pavement if you get it on pavement with a blower, however you do it efficiently, a broom, whatever. Don't fertilize on frozen soil or just before events where you're likely to get runoff, like heavy rains. It's a really good idea to water in the fertilizer application lightly after you put it down. For a couple of reasons. One is some of that nitrogen can be lost as a gaseous form if you don't water it in, and also to get it in case a rain comes, a really heavy rain, it'll be down in the soil where it's not going to run off as readily. Okay. And then periodically soil test to determine your phosphorus levels as well as your lime requirement too, so you can get your soil balanced properly and it'll utilize those nutrients more efficiently.
That's it.
Yes?
That was good. You had talked about soil compaction, but you didn't really mention anything about aeration as a maintenance.
Yes. I mean, I could go on and on about, we could do 4 hours of this, but aeration is really important too in helping infiltration occur on compacted sites. Now, my gripe with a lot of professional companies is when they go in and aerate a lawn. I'll understand what I mean by aeration. It's machines with these little hollow cores, and you pull out cores, right? You're just pulling out cores. They don't do it enough. Like they'll make one pass over the lawn. And whereas I would like to see them make like 5 or 6 passes and get more holes in there. So that will really break up those compacted soils and allow better infiltration. Also, it's a really good thing to do if you put a lime application down. Because lime moves really slow through the soil, but if you aerate and then put a lime application down, some of that will go down those aeration holes and get down to the roots where it's going to do some good.
Hey, I have another question for you. My property has a PP&L easement going on it, and they were recently through replacing all those 100-foot poles with really powerful electric wires. And they put cribbing down, which compacted the turf and killed it. Now, when they came back, I was surprised. They took the cribbing up, and rather than scraping off that dead sod, they kind of just roughed it up and boxed it and got rid of a little bit of stone. But there's now it's probably been 2.5, 3 weeks, seeds coming up. Now, they didn't fertilize it at all. Is this a new seeding for a starter fertilizer, or?
Yeah, and you know, again, I don't know what your soil situation is like, or the past history of fertilization, but if you're concerned about it not moving fast enough before summer. So here's the issue in spring seedings. You want to get plants fairly mature before it goes into the heat of the summer. Because if they go into the heat of the summer as seedlings, there's a good chance they're not going to make it. Like summer we had last summer, even if they were in good shape, you know, it was a really hot, dry summer. So you want to try to get, I keep stressing fast establishment, and that also means mowing fairly soon after seed, and that helps plants mature so they can survive the summer months better. So starter fertilizer will help with that. I mean, you don't want to go overboard. One application should do it, but yes, that should help in the early stages of development.
Yeah, I was surprised when they came through, they didn't put any fertilizer down.
Yeah, well, you know, this is a power company,
Yeah.
so they'll just, you know, they're trying to cut their costs, obviously. They're not experts in that area. The same with a lot of construction companies I see. They'll just come in and do the minimum and then
Get in,
go,
get out, yeah.
and then never come back. And then somebody has to make a decision on what to do after that. And a lot of times that won't happen for months at a time. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about maintaining height of grass and lawn, and if that has any impact on fertilizer requirements?
Probably doesn't have a lot of impact on fertilizer requirement. It does have some. If you're mowing really short, like for example, Beaver Stadium, or our football stadium in Penn State is Kentucky Bluegrass, right? So they mow at about just under 1.5 inches, which is pretty short for Kentucky Bluegrass, okay? And they want a really dense field. So in order to get that density and get to the point where the turf can survive pretty well under those conditions, they put more nitrogen down than you would put in lawn. And the shorter you go, the more maintenance. You know, you have more weeds, you're going to have just more water, more everything. So we usually suggest somewhere between 2 and 3 inches in height for bluegrass and ryegrass lawns. 2 is actually fairly short. So 2.5 to 3 is my optimum. 3.5 for tall fescue, maybe fine fescues. Now, my counterparts down in Maryland are recommending 3 to 4 inches. I think 4 inches is not really lawn height. It's now you get into like a meadow. But that's a personal preference. Yes?
Is it possible to use wood ash from the fireplace instead of lime on the lawn?
That's, yeah, a lot of, when I first got in the industry, a lot of some of the older superintendents on golf courses used to burn their leaves, you know, back when that was still legal. And then they would take the ashes and they would spread that, if you can do that evenly. Now that was a little bit difficult, right? But that's what they would do. And there's a lot of potassium in there. Now there's not much nitrogen and there's not much phosphorus. There is some, but not much. Mostly that's a good source of potassium. So yes, it has some benefits, but you're not going to see a huge green up from that.
So it doesn't really replace lime?
Wood ash, I'm not so sure. You know, the wood ash is a little different. Like the leaf ash is a little different. The wood ash, it's got to be really, really fine, and it's got to be spread, you know, quite evenly distributed over a large area. Yeah. Wood itself is not good, because wood ties up nitrogen, like sawdust, for example. It'll bind nitrogen. It's actually the microbes. We call that immobilization of nitrogen. If you put too much carbon down relative to the amount of nitrogen, like you would find in sawdust, the microbes will start chewing on the nitrogen, and they'll use it all up. And then all the nitrogen is incorporated into microorganisms, and the plants can get it. It's probably more information than you wanted.
So what you were saying here, though, the nitrogen is really necessary to decompose dead stuff. Is that?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a really limiting source of a nutrient for microorganisms in the soil. So, you know, when we put nitrogen down, there's been studies looking at microbial populations, and they spike. Doesn't matter if it's organic or inorganic. If it's available nitrogen, that will really stimulate microorganisms to grow. And that's usually the most limiting source of getting microbes to grow. If you have, like I said, if you have a lot of carbon, like straw or sawdust, that doesn't necessarily stimulate microbes. You got to put the nitrogen in with it.
Hampton always provides leaf mulch, and a couple of pickup trucks in the
Yeah.
garden, and, you know,
That's what I use
a
too.
couple of pounds of blood does wonders for breaking it down quick.
And there's usually, you know, that's one of the things that was an advantage back when they were collecting grass clippings. You can get faster composting with the leaf material. Leaf material will still, there's still enough nitrogen in there where it will compost, but it takes longer. So eventually you can get to that point. But if you know, one way to speed that up is, like, sometimes I'm doing research, I have a little nitrogen left over from some of the products that the companies give me. So I just bring it home and I throw it in my compost pile, which is contain a lot of oak leaves, and it speeds up the composting process because it stimulates microbial activity. So. Yes.
Excuse me, if you planted a new, like patches of the dead spots in your lawn, and you plant grass in the
Yeah.
spring, how soon after you plant the grass can you put a weed and feed down?
Usually I suggest mowing it about 2 or 3 times before you put a, now when you say weed and feed, there are 2 types of weed and feed. One is a crabgrass preventer.
Yeah.
Okay,
Crabgrass.
and the other one is for broadleaf weeds like dandelions and clover.
Well, no, it would be like the Scots, what Scots calls their weed and feed, the first application that you put down in the spring.
Yeah, well, if it's crabgrass preventer, that is not selective. So I wouldn't be seeding within about a month or 2 of that application. You might get lucky, but usually it's going to be longer than that. If you put crabgrass preventer down, I would wait until the following September before I seed again.
But if you do have your...
That prevents crabgrass seed from germinating, but it also prevents your turfgrass seed from germinating too. Okay, there are special ones you can buy, but not for homeowners. Okay, now for broadleaf weeds, for dandelions and things like that, if you put that down, I would wait up till you mow the grass a couple of times before seeding, because even the broadleaf herbicides can damage young grass seedlings too.
And before you mow the first time, how long? What, about 3 inches or something?
Yeah, something like that. We have this general rule that nobody ever follows because it's almost impossible. That don't take off more than 1/3 of the leaf tissue in a single mowing. Yeah, I know, especially this time of year. So, that's all well and good to say. It's a good rule of thumb to try to follow, but in reality, that's not going to fly. So, I always, if it's new seedings, I always use a foot test. I go out and I put my foot down on it, and if it doesn't come back up within a few seconds, I know it's a little bit too soon to put any traffic on it. So I just put my foot down on it very lightly. If it starts to come up very slowly, it can probably tolerate light traffic like a rotary mower. Okay, as long as the soil isn't too wet, and then you can get in and mow. So it's more the stage of development rather than the height. Okay, well, I guess we're almost at that time, so yeah, 11:59.
Perfect.
Perfect time. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Very interesting, thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I didn't mention this, a soil test you can get from Penn State's Cooperative Extension Office. It's a kit, it comes as a little envelope with a little bag. You take the soil, and it gives you instructions. The important thing is to get a representative sample.
It's a whole new height.
It could be difficult if you don't have the right.
Typically want to do it.
No, and I'll be honest with you.
Oh, yeah. We suggest, like, let's say you have 5,000
last
square
pipe
feet
that was
yard.
put in the job.
Or let's say your
The
yard's
guys
about as big as
that
this
were out
room.
there,
I would
they
take
were
about
supposed to be able to
12
reuse that pipe, but it was
about
So that
What
kid,
he
kid
was
is able
able
to
to do, I
sustain
said,
growth
you should
and
take a cut
something
piece
you can
out.
get from.
Well, what you do is,
That's
they tell you to do is, you put them in a bucket,
How much
and then you
man
move around,
moved over when you
and
put
then
these
you
in?
substitute.
Sometimes
Sometimes you can, like, it's about a
I said,
pint.
take that pipe,
So
cut
12
that section
substitutes,
out and get it over and put it together.
I have a source here.
Well, then all I have is an 18 to 20 inch piece of pipe, much better than that.
And that goes in the bucket, and I can use
But
it
that's
about
the
half
inside
an
of the
hour.
box, when it's all the styrofoam that they knocked out.
So they tell you to mix it up and
This
then
much
take a
more
substitute out of
whole
it and make a styrofoam box.
That's
And
what,
then
that's what.
Do they charge for the service?
Yeah, you charge for the kit. So I said nine, last I heard it was $9.
Okay, so this is like main campus? or-
Good thing you caught that,
You
Dan.
can get it through,
Yeah.
what county are you?
Runoff area.
Cumberland County. Call Cumberland County and ask them if they do this.
So I just seen that done.
So I thought, okay, if
You're gonna,
Yeah,
I just talked to Jeremy,
Jackie's still got
probably,
Yeah, well,
that
or,
whole
So every county
piece
has
line through
like a-
Delbrook.
Every
Yes,
county,
my
so as far as I know now,
we're
all these changes.
I don't know, when they ask me,
I was like, hey, there's a line there. What is it?
well, we can do that every, when I do.
think that's
I
what
know,
you're
right,
Right,
yeah,
that's already like a-
internet sites.
Well, I was really called it.
I don't remember. I honestly don't remember.
Well, it's,
Sure.
I know for a fact it's one of them is not.
One other thing that you put down.
I think, I don't know. I kind of, after looking at it
Critter stinging up.
bits and pieces,
Is there any issues with
I
that?
think I know what's there.
There are some issues with this, the most common material that you buy there.